How serious is Iran's threat to disrupt shipping in the Red Sea? After the Strait of Hormuz, the Revolutionary Guard says the Bab al-Mandab Strait could be next. How far would Iran's allies in Yemen go to support it? And what would a disruption in Bab al-Mandab mean for the global economy? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. Some call it the Gate of Tears. Bab al-Mandab in the Red Sea wields importance as a global shipping artery. Well, this week, Iran's Revolutionary Guard threatened to use the strait as its next front in the war with the US. It says regional energy exports are either for everyone or no one at all. Well, such a move would mean relying on its Houthi allies in Yemen to block the shipping route. Iran's warning comes amid an escalation with the US, which has endangered the fragile agreement they reached late last month. But how serious is the Revolutionary Guard's threat? What would it mean for a volatile region and the global economy? We'll talk to our guests in a moment, but first, this report from Farea.
Although the US says talks with Iran are continuing, the latest exchange of strikes is breaking down the agreement that was meant to pave the way to a final deal to end the war. Iran has effectively closed the Strait of Hormuz, the crucial waterway through which 20% of global oil exports transit, and the US has reimposed its naval blockade of Iranian ports. Iran's ability to disrupt commercial shipping has given it leverage in the negotiations. On Wednesday, the Revolutionary Guard threatened to close all other export corridors that benefit the US and its allies. That is being seen as a warning that Iran could close the Bab al-Mandab Strait with support from Ansar Allah, also known as the Houthis in Yemen. Bab al-Mandab links the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea by way of the Gulf of Aden, Red Sea and Suez Canal. At its narrowest point between Djibouti and Yemen, the strait is about 29 kilometers wide. Roughly 12% of global trade passes through the waterway, including nearly a third of the world's container traffic. Disruptions there could force ships travelling between Asia and Europe to go around the southern tip of Africa, adding time and cost. Between 2023 and 2025, during Israel's war on Gaza, the Houthis conducted dozens of attacks on commercial vessels in the Bab al-Mandab Strait. A US-led coalition carried out strikes in Yemen and launched joint naval patrols in response. The Houthi attacks largely stopped after the Gaza ceasefire took effect in October last year. If Iran persuades the Houthis to reopen their campaign against shipping in the Red Sea, the conflict would expand beyond the Gulf, threatening another major artery of global trade and increasing the economic cost of the conflict. Farea, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Well, let's bring our guests into the show. We have joining us from Tehran in Iran, Ali Ahmadi. He's an executive fellow at the Geneva Center for Security Policy. He specializes in economic statecraft. Ian Ralby is in Baltimore, Maryland. He's a senior fellow at the Center for Maritime Strategy. He's advised shipping companies and governments on maritime security. And in London, Farea al-Muslimi, a research fellow at the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House. He specializes in Yemen and the wider Gulf region. A warm welcome to you all. If I could start with Ian. So, Ian, do we know at this point how much of the world's trade, how much of its vital goods goes through the Bab al-Mandab Straits? And the reason I'm asking is when you do a little bit of research, it seems prior to the Gaza war in 2023, oil, for example, 9% of the global trade went through the Bab al-Mandab. But then after that, it seems to have gone down. And then the reports it went up again when the Straits of Hormuz were closed. What's the current situation?
Yeah, being exact with numbers and percentages is very difficult right now, but your general trend analysis is absolutely right. Once the Houthis started attacking ships, beginning with the Galaxy Leader, which we saw in the opening there on the 19th of November 2023, we saw a major decline in all traffic through the Red Sea. As was noted, about a third of the world's container traffic went through the Red Sea, and that has not resumed. The oil and gas exports through that critical waterway, however, have started rebounding because of the limited access through the Strait of Hormuz and the need to get oil moving in order to meet global demands for energy. So we had about a low of around 30% of pre-November 19th, 2023 traffic. But that started to rebound up to about maybe 45% of where it was before. And now we're seeing it starting to surge a little bit more. However, the segments of the economy are different on different ships. In other words, container traffic behaves differently than tanker traffic. And even within the tanker market, we see differences between crude oil, refined products, and other gas products. LNG and LPG behave differently than crude oil and fuel. So each of those has slightly different dynamics at play. And what we're seeing is a shift from the Gulf pumping oil through Saudi Arabia to the Red Sea ports in order to get the oil moving out that way. And that has led to this major spike in Red Sea traffic just in the last few months.
Okay, so in the sense of, at the very least, oil, it's proving increasingly important as Saudi Arabia diverts oil away from trying to ship it through the Strait of Hormuz and taking it instead to Bab al-Mandab. I think what we're saying is that its importance is increasing in the last few weeks and months to the world economy. Ali, in Tehran, does Iran have the seriousness, does it have the capability to actually close the Bab al-Mandab Straits, as it seems the Revolutionary Guard is threatening to do so?
I mean, I think up to this point, whether it's the Iranian government or the Revolutionary Guard, or it's the Ansarullah group, the Houthis in Yemen, they've been resigned to basically you pocketing this as more of a threat than something that they're actually doing actively. That has certainly had an effect on insurance premiums for shipping, for example. It's caused some anxiety, but actually exercising a threat is something that they haven't gone through with yet. In terms of whether they have the capacity to do it, in short, the answer is yes. You would probably have some leakage through the Bab al-Mandab, as has been the case with the Strait of Hormuz. But when you have an active conflict in a very narrow waterway, and you have Ansarullah group in Yemen firing cruise missiles or drones at ships that are essentially violating their order not to cross, then between the insurance premiums and the different risk considerations, most international companies, most freight companies, and even oil carriers are not going to risk going through it. So it might not completely close, but there might be some ships passing, but the volume is likely to decrease drastically, mostly along the lines of what we've seen in the Strait of Hormuz.
All right, so they could do it. Farea, what signals have we had from the Houthis if Iran did take the political decision that it wanted to close the Bab al-Mandab? What kind of signals have we had from the Houthis on how far they would go in supporting such a request by Iran?
The Houthis have closed or tried to close Bab al-Mandab in the past in 2023 and attack ships in the Red Sea with and without Iran's requests and support. I do want to say, however, that I think first, the Iranians, first time they invested, according to our Chatham House research, the first time they invested in having a presence in Bab al-Mandab was actually in 2007. They already have built the first military unit in that end of Yemen by that time. And furthermore, I would also not say that the Houthis are the only exclusive person in Bab al-Mandab and the Red Sea who can actually hinder a lot of the trades, and they're not the only allies Iran has. We have a lot of both the criminal gangs, but even Shabab and other actors at the Horn of Africa who have been coordinating with the Houthis and who actually can close it. So, of course, it's one nightmare to have Hormuz shut down, but I think it's two nightmares to have Hormuz and Bab al-Mandab. And that applies, as Ali was saying, it can easily create a fear and panic among insurance companies, but also similarly to the Gulf countries. I think that right now, Saudi Arabia could afford, to a certain point, Hormuz crisis because it had different routes. If that happens, and I think that's one of the consequences we will see of the recent Houthi-Saudi retaliation in the borders, I think when and if that happens, then that's going to be another level of nightmare. And I actually see that happening. And there is many reasons why we have seen the recent escalation in Yemen between the Houthis and the Iranians and the Saudis. One reason of that is, of course, the Iranian Saudi arrangement from 23 have collapsed after Iran attacked Saudi borders, since a fundamental part about it was no cross-border attacks on Saudi, but also for domestic Yemeni reasons. The Houthis have been for a while, the last 1 to 2 years actually, in any way looking for a war to escape the current domestic economic, but also political and social pressure they are facing on the ground. And
right.
a group like the Houthis have one solution for every problem, which is they run to a war. I will not be surprised to see further of that for both Iran's projection of power, but also for the Houthis' own domestic calculations.
Okay, you've opened a whole bunch of questions in my mind, Farah, but before we go too deeply, I want to bring Ian back in briefly and ask this question. Listening to Farah's analysis there, it's obviously a very different political situation when you compare it to the Strait of Hormuz. It's a different geography at Bab al-Mandab compared to the Strait of Hormuz. Just how susceptible, how vulnerable is shipping to disruption in the Bab al-Mandab compared to the Strait of Hormuz, which we've seen get disrupted very quickly, very easily?
Same. Very quickly, very easily would be the answer. I think the Houthis learned a lot about attacking ships between November 19th, 2023 and today. They learned from the Iranians, but they also learned from their own experience, and the whole world has now learned from their experience. And one of the unfortunate takeaways is that it doesn't take a whole lot to disrupt shipping. While a military may find a 99% success rate satisfactory or even exemplary, 99% means for the shipping industry that 1% is catastrophic, and that's not good. And that is, in some cases, a bet the company percentage. So this is a very potentially volatile situation, given the Houthis' ability with very little effort and high impact to attack ships. The other thing that the Houthis learned and that others have learned from them is asymmetry is very difficult to push back against. That's difficult both from a military standpoint, which is part of what we're seeing in the Strait of Hormuz. We've heard the President of the United States say over and over again that the U.S. has wiped out the entire Iranian Navy, and yet they attack ships seemingly at will. Similarly, in Ukraine, the Ukrainians had almost no navy, and yet have undermined and in some cases overmatched the mighty Russian Federation Black Sea Fleet. And so this asymmetry is becoming a military concern for bigger, more powerful gray hull navies because it is very easy to undermine them. But the other asymmetry is economic. It costs $5,000 or less to make a drone that could have high impact and actually sink a ship. Countering that may cost $5 million. And so if the Houthis are able to overwhelm any kind of defensive operation, they can maintain a degree of superiority and at least a degree of disruption that is sufficient to keep shipping out. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. The Houthis know what they're doing, and they've been transferring that to others. One of their last major strategic escalations in the big campaign was to develop an alliance with other groups, including in the Horn of Africa, where we've seen not only technology transfer, but insight transfer. And many of the recent attacks have gone unnoticed because of being overshadowed by the Strait of Hormuz. But we've had more piracy incidents in the Northwest Indian Ocean, the Gulf of Aden, and the near areas of Yemen in the last couple of months than we had in the last 10 years. And so that's a worrying sign for multiple fronts of disruption, as we just heard.
All right. Briefly, Farah, before I go back to Ali in Tehran, briefly, that scenario we're now talking about, would it mean the collapse of the ceasefire agreement between Saudi and the Ansarullah Houthis?
I think the recent escalation suggests we will have various consequences. One of them is obviously the fragile truce between Saudi Arabia and Houthis. I think we have seen the end of it. I think we have seen the end of the Beijing arrangement between the Saudis and the Iranians. But I think in addition to that, unfortunately, even worse and more catastrophically, we have seen a collapse of the fragile possibility of a roadmap in Yemen, which means, for example, it just shut down the long-awaited exchange of prisoners between the Houthis and the government, which could have changed the lives of thousands of families across Yemen. That's, for now, I think, was on a very long hold. And I think we will see even a further ground fighting in Yemen between the Houthis and their components. And I would not be surprised if we actually see a further attack on the economic infrastructure inside the Gulf, specifically inside Saudi Arabia by the Houthis.
Ali, in Tehran, would it serve Iranian interest to have that level of disruption spread across the Gulf, as Farea was pointing out, to have Saudi Arabia engage deeper once again in the Yemen conflict?
Well, up until a few months ago, the answer would have been clearly no. But what's happened since the war started is, of course, that the airspace and the bases of various of the American forces have been, the primary vehicle through which attacking Iran. Right now, there's a lot of American military assets in various bases of Saudi Arabia, and operations are being carried out from there. Now, with the Houthis coming more into play, a lot of air defense assets, a lot of resources are going to have to be spread more thin in Saudi Arabia, and the American military resources that have been brought to bear in Saudi Arabia, that could potentially have some positive impact, but also in terms of the price of oil. I mean, obviously, what Donald Trump has done is, to some extent, his wager, his gamble here is that the price of oil won't go up past a certain point, creating a lot of political problems for him in approaching the midterm elections in the U.S. If this further complicates the global supply chain in terms of energy, then that would put a lot of pressure on the United States to come back to the negotiating table rather than insist on, a more maximalist set of demands.
Ian, what would the closure of Bab al-Mandab mean for some of the world's critical supplies?
Yeah, so I think directional flows is really important to understand here. Before this war, on the 28th of February, 80% of the Middle Eastern oil, that is about 29% of global seaborne trade in crude, about 19 or so percent of both fuel products and LNG, and about 13% of fertilizer and LPG were coming out and heading to Asia. That means they need to head east from the Middle East. And that means that if the Strait of Hormuz is closed and the supplies can't get out that way, and they instead have to flow across land to the Red Sea, the only option if the Bab al-Mandab is closed is to go through the Suez Canal. The problem with the canal is multifold. One, it's more expensive. Two, it can't handle a very large crude carrier, the largest of the oil tankers that can move huge amounts.
So it's a one-way flow for some of what they call the VLCCs, the very large
correct
tankers that carry oil.
Yeah.
But some, assumedly, could go north?
North to where?
Suez Canal.
I mean, they've got to pick up somewhere. They can go up to the north, they can lighter, they can unload, they can then cross, and then they can load back up on the other side. That's how they would have to operate. But the problem is then they're in the Mediterranean and need to get to Asia. And so what we're looking at is just huge amounts of increase in fuel to transport goods, as well as issues with the directional flow and time of transport. When you look at a VLCC, one of those tankers, they carry 2 million barrels of oil. To truck that would require 20,000 trucks. So when we are looking at volumes, we have to keep in mind these are enormous benefits to the economy in terms of just how much they can move in a single voyage. We can't make up for that, is the short of it. And so we've been benefiting from a couple of things. Increased production in the United States and in Venezuela and a couple of other markets have reduced some of the overall shortfall. Additionally, the biggest factor has been China reducing its demand, and it's been doing that somewhat artificially, which it could change at any moment. And we've had sanctions relief against both Russian and Iranian oil at different times in order to lighten some of this global burden. If all of those factors conspire and reverse, we're in a huge amount of global shortfall. And at the moment, U.S. critical strategic reserves are down to the lowest level they've been since 1983 and decreasing on a weekly basis. So we're just dealing with a barrel count issue that just can't be made up if critical choke points are closed.
Which maybe brings me to my next question. Farea, when you look at the strategic map, what counter move does the US still have in its pocket from what you can see should the Bab al-Mandeb Strait be closed? And we have a situation where both the Strait of Hormuz and Bab al-Mandeb is closed.
I think one thing we also have to remember is that the impact of any closure of Bab al-Mandeb actually is very bad to many countries, but it's really, really bad for countries like Egypt and Jordan and others in the region who so far have survived to a certain point the impact of the Hormuz. So any action by the US under the assumption that it cannot change things or bring stability without these countries, I think is a lot of illusion. Because as Ian said earlier, this is a pretty easy war from the non-state actor side, the Houthis, to actually win. All they have to do is to throw $1,000 and the US will throw $1 million. So unless a collective regional security framework and architect in which the regional countries are involved in, which also is related to other conflicts in the region, going from Gaza to the one in Lebanon, let's remember, these are very connected conflicts, and this is why we have this war, is because of other wars that are happening in the region. So unless there is a political and diplomatic architect that looks into the region as a total, I don't think we will end up going far in matter of stability or have much of a choices. And let's remember that...
So Farea, are you saying basically you don't see a counter-move option for the US at this point?
Militarily speaking, it has tried in the past. It was able to little bit paralyze the Houthis, but not beyond that, actually, pretty much. I think specifically what we are witnessing in Yemen, but also in the Red Sea, is also because there is no Gulf unified policy toward Yemen. I do not think, even with its military capabilities, the US can actually make a difference as it thinks it can, or as it in the past in many regards. There is a very limited cards it has in its hand, and I think the short face or the short-term thinking of a President Trump is very different, and I don't think it will go far in securitizing the Bab al-Mandeb, but it's also because he's not coordinating even with the European Unions. Let's remember, everyone have their own security policy in the Red Sea, and that's not helpful.
Okay, Ali, I'm connecting the dots of what our two other speakers are saying. Ian is making the picture very clear that there would be some significant cost to the world should the Bab al-Mandeb Strait be closed. Farea has made it clear he doesn't see a lot of cards in the hands of the US to counter that. I guess then the question is, why hasn't Iran moved to do that at this point in the conflict with the US? Why hasn't it tried to close the Bab al-Mandeb?
Well, I mean, definitely right that this would cause a lot of problems. I would simply add just that there is also an issue of natural gas flows through the Red Sea to Europe, which would also be disrupted, which also should be taken into account, that and fuel products. But in terms of why this hasn't happened already, partially because Ansarullah in Yemen, the Houthis, wanted to maintain the truce they have with Saudi Arabia, which has obviously come under a lot of pressure, especially because of the Saudis insisting no flights happen through the airport in Sana'a. Now that has been an issue that's become full of tension over the past couple of weeks. But it's also the fact that this was better essentially used as a threat than something that one would actually do. Obviously, during the 39-day conflict, where it was an active, hot conflict, more so than it is now, we were on an escalation ladder and we never reached the top of it. There was no broad attacks against Iranian infrastructure.
What is the threshold point or trigger from your understanding of Iranian calculations where they say, okay, now it's time to call our friends amongst the Ansarullah Houthis and try and get the Bab al-Mandeb closed?
I think it's one of two things. I think it's either broad attacks on Iranian infrastructure, including, say, power generation infrastructure or the oil terminal on Harg Island, but also it could simply just be Trump settling into an idea that this conflict can just go on for a very long time, and that somehow the U.S. can handle the pressure and Iran won't. So it's basically a militarized version of the maximum pressure sanctions campaign, where the expectation would be this goes on for a while. President Trump was asked about whether this is a forever war, and he said, well, Vietnam was 19 years. It's not. So the idea that this is going to just continue on and on for months on end is something something that Iran might actually be better positioned for, depending on how you look at it, than the United States. But it's not necessarily something Iran wants to tolerate in the long term.
On that point, Ian, you mentioned the challenges facing the strategic reserves. Have they not had a chance during, well, the time in which it seemed like the ceasefire was holding to refill? How much of a refill went on? How much time does the world have before we start to see an energy shock?
Yeah, I don't have the specific numbers, but it seems that they've continued to decrease. The relief was not relief in the sense of going back to normal. That's really important to understand that during the period between the 18th of June and the signing of the MOU and this last week when we saw a resumption of hostilities, we did not have normal travel through the Strait of Hormuz. We saw about 40 to 45 ships going in either direction each day. That is a far cry from the 130 to 160 we saw previous to the war. So this is a really important point to note. We saw a lot of the pre-war oil get out, but none of the new supply moving. And trade is a two-way movement. It's got to keep going. And we haven't seen that flow occur. So we didn't see a replenishment. We saw a slight relief, which dropped the price a bit, but it did not bring us back to having enough supply to meet global demand. And I want to make a point, just based on what the other speakers have said, that I completely agree with. This can't be solved militarily, because as long as there remains a will to be disruptive for whatever reason, whether it's in Iran and whether it's in Yemen or whether it's elsewhere, it can be done. So this has to be a multifaceted response.
Okay.
And with the oil sector, yeah, go ahead.
I just want to bring Ali back in for a very brief comment. You said, the US can't go on forever with this kind of stuff. What about Iran with a blockade on its ports or its ability to export oil? How long can it stand?
Well, so the calculation with the U.S. blockade on top of the Iranian blockade last time around, before the MOU was signed, was that basically Iran's storage capacity is fairly limited. It pumps a significant amount of oil out of the ground. Obviously, it uses a lot of it, but it also exports a lot of it. If the oil just racks up in the storage containers and Iran just simply runs out of floating storage, whether on ships or on land storage, then it's going to have to start producing less oil. And you can only do that to a certain point before you start seriously damaging the wellhead. This isn't a kind of thing where you can just turn it on and off like a faucet. If you turn off these wells, you might do long-term damage to how much oil can be drawn from them. Now, Iran has managed to export anywhere between 60 or 80 million barrels, or at least get them out of the Strait of Hormuz area. So it has created a significant buffer zone for itself. I would say more than the U.S. has, and so it can definitely last a while. On the other hand, the United States, as your other guest said,
is in a bind too.
Yes,
I'm afraid we are out of time. I apologize. We'll have to end it there. Let's thank our guests, Ali Ahmadi, Ian Ralby and Farea al-Muslimi. Thank you too for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For now, that's it from me, Sami, Zeidan, and the whole team here. Al Jazeera's coverage continues in a moment, so do stay with us.